Unfortunately, no lieutenant on patrol, believing that unconscious individual two threads held out their most precious blood. And two, I believe, were a female conscious and bleeding who lost consciousness during mass. Two party 3s and 2-4s on patrol 3. Two party 3s and 2-4s on patrol 3. Two party 3s and 2-4s on patrol 3.
Engine 72. Six 13 lesson 13 lesson. One responding.
Engine 4,
پسروینو دا د شهیدانو کور دا د باتورانو کور دا د باتورانو کور دا د باتورانو کور دا د باتورانو کور ساتوي پسروینو دا د شهیدانو کور دا
Good evening. It's Tuesday, December 24, 2024. I'm Suleiman Talash and you are watching RTN News. Let's dive into today's news updates. Aibek Arifus Manov, Uzbek ambassador in a meeting with Maulavi Abdul Salam Hanafi, the administrative deputy of the Prime Minister, expressed his satisfaction with the good relation between the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan and his country and said that Uzbek government is keen to develop economic and trade relations with Afghanistan. In this meeting, Mr. Hanafi assured that Uzbek ambassador that the Islamic Emirate is committed to providing investment opportunities for Uzbek investors. Let's see more in this report.
Maulavi Abdul Salam Hanafi The administrative deputy to the Prime Minister expressed his satisfaction in the meeting with the Uzbek ambassador. A bank lawyer Osmanov appreciated his efforts in strengthening relations between the two countries in various fields. In this meeting, the Uzbek ambassador expressed his satisfaction with the good relations between the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan and his country, and said that the Uzbek government is keen to develop economic and trade relations with Afghanistan. The Uzbek government is keen to develop economic and trade relations with
During the meeting, the Uzbek ambassador expressed satisfaction during the meeting good relations between the two countries and informed about the readiness of his trade and investment. He said that Uzbek businessmen and investors are interested in building health centers, importing medicine, building cement factories, and trade in coal.
At the same time, Turkish religious scholars and investors met with the Minister of Energy and Water and the Deputy Minister of Industry and Commerce and expressed their interest in investing in solar power generation and the export of raw materials for carpets and rugs to Turkey.
During the meeting, Turkish investors expressed their interest in investing in the solar power generation, and businessmen of this country also wanted to trade raw materials for carpets and rugs to that country. The Deputy Minister of Industry and Commerce of the ministry announced cooperation with the Turkish investors in the mentioned areas.
On the other hand, officials of the Chamber of Commerce and Investment consider economic relations between the two countries and Afghanistan to be effective and emphasize their continuation.
ټول نفتی مواد سوخت مواد د ازبکستان نه راوړو اکثره
We import all oil and fuel from Uzbekistan, which is proceeding normally. In addition, some of our exports such as iron, steel, marble, and non-alcoholic beverages are regularly exported to the mentioned country. Turkish investors or Uzbek investment in Afghanistan plays an important role in the economic sector of Afghanistan because Uzbekistan is a country that has been trying to expand its trade with South Asia through Afghanistan since the Islamic Emirate regained power.
It's worth mentioning that, since the establishment of the Islamic Emirate, officials and investors from regional and international countries have shown interest in investing in various sectors within the country and have welcomed the Islamic Emirate, but so far, several countries have not invested in their commitments.
Maulavi Sardar Ahmad Shakib, the ambassador of the Islamic Emirate in Islamabad, met with Saeed bin Masood al-Harisi, head of the Organization for Islamic Cooperation and Solidarity in Pakistan. The Afghan embassy in Pakistan said that in this meeting, the two sides discussed the activities of the organization in the Islamic world, academic conferences, recent developments in bilateral relations between Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan, and a number of other issues. The Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan has called the recent remarks of the Pakistani Defense Minister about Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi irresponsible, saying that these statements are due to his ignorance of historical facts. Hamdullah Fitrat, deputy spokesperson of the Islamic Emirate, added that although Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi was a Muslim and Afghan, he in sympathy and cooperation with all oppressed and threatened nations in the region because of his faithful responsibility. Let's see more in this report. The Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan considers the statements of Khwaja Asif, Pakistani Defense Minister, a few days ago about Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi irresponsible and his lack of knowledge of historical facts. The deputy spokesman for the Islamic Emirate says that Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi traveled to India and other regions to save and liberate oppressed nations, especially Muslims.
تاریخ شاهد ده سلطان محمود غزنوی رحمه الله.
History has witnessed that Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi, may Allah have mercy on him, always went to India and other places for the salvation and freedom of oppressed people. And Ghaznavi, may Allah have mercy on him, is a great honor of all Muslims. It is a matter of regret that People at the level of Defense Minister of Pakistan are so ignorant of these facts. A Pakistani official is making insulting statements about Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi at a time when the country's defense missiles are named Mahmud Ghaznavi. May Allah have mercy on him.
On the other hand, some political analysts consider such views biased and stress that Pakistani officials should refrain from such views.
The words of the Pakistani defense minister about Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi are biased. He has concealed historical facts. Before he comments about Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi, he should refer to history. They should think that having good relations with Afghanistan, having deep political relations like in the past, it will be beneficial for them and for us. And if such insults increase day by day, or if they show hostility towards the current government, or stand up or confront it, then this can destroy these relations in the future.
The reactions come as Pakistani's defense minister said in an interview with a Pakistani media outlet a few days ago that Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi was traveling to India, which was then part of Pakistan, to loot. Maulavi Muhammad Qasim Amiri, the head of Panjshir's Department of Mines and Petroleum, says that the extraction of emerald mines in this province has provided direct and indirect employment opportunities to 10,000 people. According to Mr. Amiri, so far 590 people have been granted professional mining licenses for precious and semi-precious stones. 4,156 people have been granted business licenses and 550 others have been granted soil exploration licenses. Officials from the Badakhshan Provincial Department of Agriculture, Irrigation and Livestock say that 290 greenhouses have been built in 16 districts of the province. According to officials, these greenhouses were built to strengthen the economy of families and provide people with access to a variety of foods. The Ministry of Rural Rehabilitation and Development has launched the investigation work of the Kajis Samad Dam in Farah province at a cost of about 2 billion Afghanis during a gathering including Mullah Muhammad Yunus Khunzada, the Minister of Rural Rehabilitation and Development, and his delegation. During the opening of the investigation work of the dam, the Minister of Rural Rehabilitation and Development spoke about the importance of the economic and social benefits of this major national project. This dam, which is approximately 56 meters high and can store 140 million cubic meters of water, is located in a large arid region of Farah and Nimrod's provinces and is of vital importance for this dry and waterless region. During the construction of the dam, thousands of workers will be provided with employment opportunities, and upon completion, 14,000 hectares of agricultural land will be irrigated. The Disaster Management Directorate of Bamiyan Province, with the support of the World Social Services Organization in Asia, has launched the first phase of cash assistance for 900 vulnerable and needy families in Yakaulang district. The assistance was distributed in the center of Yakaulang district in the presence of local authorities and security officials, following the agreement between the National Disaster Management Directorate and the CWSA organization. After conducting a survey, the Disaster Management Directorate of Baghlan Province, with the financial support of the acted organization, distributed cash assistance to 240 families affected by the recent floods in Danai Ghuri and Duki district and the capital Pule Khumri. In this series of aid distribution, 22,560 Afghanis were distributed to each family in the presence of local officials. 250 refugees and people affected by natural disasters were provided in Laghman province with non-food items by the King Salman Charity Foundation, with the technical cooperation of the Disaster Management Department and Maulavi Akhtar Muhammad Muzammil, the Deputy Governor of Laghman province. Qari Khair Muhammad Ghazi, the director of the Disaster Management Department of Laghman Province, said that each family was given non-food items worth $265, including a tent, 5 blankets, and a complete kitchen supplies. The Deputy Governor of Laghman Province said that the provincial administration is trying to attract charitable institutions and organizations with the arrival of winter to help the people and make their winter days and nights better. Thank you for the privilege of your time. Stay connected with RTN News for the latest updates anytime, anywhere. Have a good night.
The Balkans has a long and colourful history, sitting between Western and Eastern Europe and at the gateway to the Near East. It is here that cultures and religions have clashed for centuries, during struggles for identity and freedoms leading to mistrust and even hatred being bred into each generation, just waiting to be unbottled. During the 1990s, as one nation began to fracture into 7, those old grievances began to resurface in spectacular and horrific fashion, leading into a war that would see atrocities not witnessed in Europe since the days of the Third Reich, and would not only drag in the world's greatest powers, but would also highlight their weaknesses in a battle that few outside of the region truly understood. In this episode, we are going to examine the history leading up to the Bosnian War of the 1990s, exploring the role which the international community played in the shaping of events, and ask the question, could more have been done to prevent this tragedy? Welcome to Wars of the World. World War II was one of the darkest periods in human history. Military tactics, political alliances, secret weapons and subterfuge all came together in an explosive few years. How would you have handled it all? With today's sponsor, you can explore the tactics for free in a realistic online PvP strategy game called Call of War. You choose a real country to lead during World War II and can fight up to 100 other players in real time. These games play out over days as you play the long game, meaning that you get to see how subjugated by the Austro-Hungarian, Greek, Ottoman and Russian empires for hundreds of years prior to the start of the 20th century. By the 1900s, years of displacement, peaceful relocation and even massacres had left an indelible impact on the ethnic makeup of the region, creating division along both cultural and religious lines. In the early 1910s, this left the region a hotbed of terrorist activity, particularly in Austro-Hungarian-held Bosnia, where a large number of their population had Serbian lineage, Serbia being somewhat unique in that it was an independent nation in the region. It was one such Serbian nationalist, Gavrilo Princip, that would find his name being carved into the history books when on June 28, 1914, he participated in a plan to assassinate the Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife in the Bosnian capital of Sarajevo. While his initial effort did not go according to plan, luck smiled on Princip when later that day the Archduke's driver took a wrong turn and ended up outside the very cafe where Princip had retreated. The young Bosnian Serb drew his pistol and fired into the car, killing his targets, but in so doing lit the spark that ignited the First World War. In the wake of the war, with the Austro-Hungarian Empire being dissolved, the victorious Allies found themselves involved in nation building in the Balkans, in an effort to avoid the region exploding into nationalist and ethnic violence. It was decided that given how diverse the region was, it was better to unite it under one banner and arranged as an offshoot of Serbia, greatly benefiting the ruling Serbian royal family, initially under Peter I and then King Alexander I. However, This arrangement was not welcomed by all factions, who feared the erosion of their freedoms and cultures, or who were embracing ideas such as communism or democracy. Alexander faced off assassination attempts and political turmoil in his government, until in 1929 he prorogued the parliament and installed himself as a dictator. Then, on October 3rd, 1929, he named his realm the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, with Yugoslavia roughly translating into the land of the South Slavs. However, resistance continued throughout the 1930s, spurred on by the lack of investment in non-Serbian and Muslim regions, leaving much of the rest of Yugoslavia poor and suffering from high illiteracy and mortality rates. This only deepened division in Croatia and Bosnia especially, with their high Muslim populations, to such an extent that after the Third Reich invaded on April 6, 1941, there were groups willing to work with the Germans and their allies on the promise of independence, or at least some form of independence. The pro-fascist Croatian authorities especially were eager to work with the invaders, gaining autonomy and even Bosnia and Serb land in exchange for engaging in the widespread murder of non-Croatians, along with Jews and Roma gypsies on behalf of their Nazi masters. As with nearly all occupied nations during World War II, a resistance movement rose up against the invaders and those Yugoslavians who chose to collaborate. Many of these groups were formed based on their own political ideals, such as pro-monarchists, democracy advocates, or nationalist groups seeking independence for their regions. But by far the most significant were the communists under the leadership of Josip Broz Tito. Tito's communists were among the best organized and most successful of the resistance forces, even going as far as to briefly establish a rudimentary air force with which to carry out light attack missions against the German forces. Enjoying popular support amongst the people and with the backing of the Soviet Union, in the wake of the end of the Second World War, Yugoslavia was reborn, only now under the banner of communism, with Tito as the supreme leader. However, while the country was within Moscow's sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia was not just another puppet state for Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. Indeed, there were periods during the 1960s where Tito found himself guarding against NATO in the west and the south, and against his Moscow allies in the north and the east. Internally, Tito ruled with an iron fist in the immediate post-war period, but he also recognized that this could not continue indefinitely, and so he separated Yugoslavia into 6 nominally equal republics: Croatia, Montenegro, Serbia, Slovenia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Macedonia, with his government acting in a federal capacity, overseeing disputes, maintaining national security, and being the voice of the Yugoslav people overseas. The government was highly bureaucratic, with various organizations focusing on different aspects of Yugoslav life and industry, which reduced individual power, helping to secure Tito's position even further. Then on May 4, 1980, Joseph Tito died. Much of the blame for the collapse of Yugoslavia tends to get put on the death of Tito, with his iron grip being viewed as a unifying force in a politically and ethnically diverse nation. However, this is a somewhat narrow viewpoint, as a number of factors contributed to the eventual breakup, from both before and after Tito's death. Tito himself recognized that his country was beginning to fracture unless he acted quickly in the 1970s, leading to him introducing far-sweeping political reforms. On February 21, 1974, Tito's fourth and ultimately his final constitution came enacted into law. The constitution was extremely complex and far-reaching, and included greater self-control of industry and agriculture, while maintaining the socialist ideals. Kosovo and Vojvodina, 2 constituent provinces of Serbia, also rather controversially received substantially increased autonomy, including the power of veto in the Serbian parliament, despite their ethnic makeup being predominantly Albanian and of the Muslim faith. Many of these moves went some way to appeasing independent movements within the Yugoslav republics, and appeared to be working in the second half of the 1970s, as Yugoslavia enjoyed a period of stabilization, both economically and politically. However, the constitution weakened the federal government's power, giving each republic a greater sense of identity and a taste of self-determination. The one republic that didn't welcome the reforms, however, was Serbia itself, as they not only saw their own influence over the state weakened, but also feared for the future of ethnic Serbs living in predominantly Muslim republics, such as Bosnia and Croatia. Having been such a force in Yugoslavian politics for so long, the death of Tito and his reforms created a power vacuum within the federal government, whose members increasingly focused on the needs and wants of their own republics, rather than those of the state, which only exacerbated the growing sense of national identity in those individual republics. Adding to this problem was the growing unrest in Kosovo, which began demanding recognition as a Yugoslavian republic, something the Serbians vehemently opposed. Tensions in Kosovo between the Eastern Orthodox Christian Serbs and the majority Albanian population thus became increasingly fraught into the 1980s, and similar scenes began to play out in the other republics. Then in 1987, a figure emerged in Serbia whose name would become synonymous with the suffering of the region in the 1990s. Slobodan Milosevic was born in Serbia on August 29, 1941, to Montenegrin parents, and was a devout communist, becoming a rising star in Serbian politics in the 1970s and 80s, before rising to power in Serbia on a wave of populist support thanks to his calls for anti-bureaucratic reform and the restricting of power in Kosovo, Vojvodina, and Montenegro. At the same time, the once strongly communist country was caught up in a wave of anti-communist revolution that was beginning to sweep through Eastern Europe as the power of the Soviet Union began to wane, as it too undertook reforms that would ultimately see it break apart. By the 1990s, respect for federal authority in Yugoslavia was largely confined to Serbia, Montenegro, and ethnic Serbs living outside the cradle of their culture. In Croatia, the nationalist Croatian Democratic Union was elected to power, led by nationalist Franjo Tuđman, under the slogan of "Protecting Croatia from Milosevic," and by association, the ethnic Serbs within the republic's borders. In the wake of the crisis, Slovenia and Croatia voted for independence, followed soon after by Bosnia. But opposition was high, particularly amongst the leadership of the Yugoslavian army, who were pushing the now almost impotent federal government to declare a state of emergency so that they could suppress the movements of independence. Instead, however, Croatia and Slovenia declared independence on June 25, 1991, in violation of Tito's 1974 constitution, as neither republic had unanimous support from the others. The European Economic Community attempted to mediate the situation, but violence between the newly independent states and the predominantly Serbian-controlled Yugoslavian army, the JNA, quickly erupted. In a dramatic move, in December 1991, Germany, which itself had only just been reunified after 45 years of being divided into East and West, recognized both Croatia and Slovenia as independent nations. The JNA continued combat operations in an effort to hold on to the land, but it was to no avail, and Yugoslavia had now begun to formally fracture. While the JNA would largely step back from the fighting in 1992, ethnic Serbs continued their fight against their new governments, with the hope of either rejoining the motherland or creating their own independent states. At the same time, calls grew for independence in Bosnia and Herzegovina. This region had a diverse population of Muslims, who became known later as Bosniaks, Bosnian Serbs, and Bosnian Croats. During the 1970s and 80s, the balance between the three groups shifted radically in favor of the Muslim population, as Yugoslavia saw widespread emigration of the latter two groups, as fears grew of what might happen to them amidst the realization that Yugoslavia as a federal entity was beginning to fracture. Nevertheless, significant populations of both remained behind, mostly congregated in enclaves for mutual protection, but also sharing large areas of land with the majority Bosniaks. As the situation with Croatia was unfolding, elections were being held in Bosnia for the government, with candidates from each group being put forward, and the results of which largely reflecting the republic's racial makeup. As a result, a tripartite coalition government was established, with Bosniak Alija Izetbegovic effectively taking on the role of president. But tensions with the Bosnian Serbs as a result of the fighting in Croatia largely stalled the government as a working entity. under the leadership of Radovan Karadzic, the Bosnian Serbs established their own Serb autonomous regions in largely Serb-held territory, supported unofficially by the JNA. These were followed by similar Bosnian Croat autonomous regions in December 1991. With Germany having already recognized the independence of Croatia and Slovenia, the European community felt compelled to invite Bosnia and Herzegovina to apply for recognition, also leading to a referendum on independence being held on February 29, 1992. This was wholly unacceptable to Karadzic, and he instructed Bosnian Serbs not to take part in order to sully the outcome. Of the nearly 2/3 of the electorate that did cast a vote, almost all of them voted for independence, leading President Izetbegovic to officially proclaim as such on March 3, 1992. The following month, on April 7th, both the European community and the United States of America formally recognized Bosnia and Herzegovina as an independent nation, feeding into growing conspiracy theory amongst Serbs that the breakup of Yugoslavia had been orchestrated by Western intelligence agencies such as the CIA or MI6. Expecting this move from the West, Bosnian Serb paramilitary groups began arming themselves and taking up defensive positions in their enclaves, as did a number of the Bosnian Croats. They also encircled the capital Sarajevo on April 5th with the aim of laying siege to the inhabitants. Several other towns and cities also became encircled and suffered repeated indiscriminate shelling and sniper fire. The European community tried to mediate the growing crisis, but fighting erupted as Bosnian Serb forces began consolidating their hold on land in the east and northern regions, expelling thousands of Bosniaks and ethnic Croats in the early stages of a policy that would become known as ethnic cleansing. The Bosnian War had begun.
Whatever thanks for nothing.
For the West, the early 1990s was an optimistic time. The Cold War had not only ended without direct military conflict between the superpowers and their allies in Europe, but it had ended with an explosion of democratic revolution in Eastern Europe. Germany had been reunified, and the biggest international crisis in decades, the 1990 invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein's Iraq, was swiftly overcome by an international military coalition led by the United States, the likes of which hadn't been seen since World War II, and who employed technology that seemed almost science fiction just 10 years prior. The United States, and by association the NATO military alliance, were therefore the most advanced, capable, and dominant military force in the world at that time. With that in mind, many asked what the powers of Western Europe were specifically going to do about the unfolding crisis right on their doorstep. NATO was still mired in the concept of mutual defense of its borders, and without a direct threat from Yugoslavia, it remained as such. As for the United States, President George Bush, fresh off his success in the Gulf War, found his attention focused increasingly on the equally appalling situation in Somalia, where US troops were aiding UN peacekeepers who found themselves outgunned and under attack by Somali warlords as they tried to deliver humanitarian aid. Having to do the same in Yugoslavia, where the situation was even more complicated than Somalia, didn't bode well with many in George Bush's Republican government. Despite this reluctance, the United Nations, on the other hand, felt compelled to get involved, primarily in the delivery of aid and the establishment of UN-protected zones, where all those inside would be disarmed by UN peacekeepers on the condition they received UN protection. This led to the Security Council passing Resolution 743 on February 21, 1992, and was focused on the situation in Croatia as fighting between the independent Croat army and the JNA paused and negotiations began. The UN peacekeepers were focused on securing 3 safe havens in Croatia, where negotiations could begin in relative safety. Dubbed the UN Protection Force, or the UNPRO-4, they optimistically secured the withdrawal of JNA troops from Croatia in May 1992, but many of the Serb population refused to accept any agreements that saw Croatia securing independence from Yugoslavia. They therefore continued their campaign of resistance, aided by their supporters in Serbia, attacking Croat government forces and non-Serb settlements, as well as convoys supplying humanitarian aid. Given the worsening situation between the Bosnia and Herzegovina government and the Bosnian Serbs, by June 1992, UNPROFOR's mission was expanded into the newly independent country. Unlike in Croatia, however, there was no ceasefire to enforce. The UN mission in Bosnia and Herzegovina therefore required a much more delicate response, lest the peacekeepers find themselves embroiled in the conflict, something that was vehemently opposed by almost all parties. The UN Protection Force's first role in Bosnia was to secure the airport in the capital city of Sarajevo, to allow the establishment of an air bridge to bring in a steady stream of aid. This began on June 5, 1992, and was later expanded to include the protection of aid convoys organized by agencies such as the International Red Cross. Peacekeepers involved in this extremely dangerous operation were authorized to defend themselves should they be attacked, but they could do very little to prevent violence from taking place to begin with.
It is not
Recognizing this, Bosnian Serb forces often tried to frustrate the convoys by establishing checkpoints on the roads, where lengthy negotiations would have to take place. Since the Bosnian Serbs weren't technically attacking the convoys, the peacekeepers had no mandate to open fire, leaving many convoys essentially stranded. In response to the world recognizing the independence of Bosnia, the Bosnian Serb population held an assembly in Banja Luka, where they declared the total severing of all governmental ties with Bosnia and Herzegovina. Serb land would later adopt the name Republika Srpska to distinguish itself from the Muslim country which they were now at war with. But rather than seek their own independence, they instead subscribed to the concept of a greater Serbia. Essentially, Serb-held land in neighboring states, becoming absorbed by Serbia, creating a larger Serbian state. In order to understand the events that were about to grip Bosnia and Herzegovina, it is important to consider just how deep the secular hatred amongst the now warring factions had begun to run, as a result of religious and cultural differences. Biljana Plavsic was a Bosnian Serb professor and vice president of the Republika Srpska, who argued for the war on scientific grounds, eerily echoing the rhetoric of the Third Reich almost 50 years earlier. During the course of the conflict, when asked whether her people should negotiate a peace settlement, she replied, quote, "It was genetically deformed material that embraced Islam, and now, of course, with each successive generation, it simply becomes concentrated. It gets worse and worse. It simply expresses itself and dictates their style of thinking, which is rooted in their genes. And through the centuries, the genes degraded further." End quote. With this mindset, just like the concept of the Nazi Aryan race, Bosnian Serbs were able to commit the vilest of atrocities, for they did not consider their enemy as human beings. For their part, on March 1st, 1992, a Muslim gunman opened fire on a Bosnian Serb wedding procession in Sarajevo, after some of the guests were seen waving Serbian flags. The next day, armed militia from both populations clashed, leaving 12 dead. It seemed as though only blood would settle the dispute. Thus, when the Bosnian Serbs planned for their war, the capital city's population was one of the first targets, believing that if the Muslim population could be eradicated there, then they could do so anywhere. And with this message, they could force the expulsion of the Muslims and the UN peacekeepers. With this goal in mind, prior to April 5th, they secretly constructed numerous bunkers around the city with which to attack anyone trying to enter or leave and strike at the city's population. The Bosnian Serb forces were superior to the hastily arranged Bosniak militia defending the city, but they were vastly outnumbered, and so they tried to starve and wear down its population through a prolonged siege. Initially, the Bosnian Serbs fought alongside the JNA under the command of Milutin Kukanjak, and targeted Muslim districts of the city. Serb forces looted and burned down houses, forcing those that they did not take prisoner to try and flee to a safer area, if one even existed. However, hundreds of men and women were separated into detention centers, the men suffering beatings and shootings, while the women, as is often the case in such bitter conflicts, suffered repeated rapings. Similar scenes took place across the countryside, and by May, nearly half of Bosnia was under Serb control. By May 2nd, the city was totally cut off from the outside world, but JNA armoured columns, which had made repeated efforts to take the city, including a powerful thrust through the centre, had failed to achieve victory, forcing them to maintain the siege and bombardment. with the world taking an increasing interest in events concerning Bosnia. On May 18, 1993, Kukanjak ordered his men to cease fire and to begin a withdrawal, following negotiations with the Bosnian government. However, this did not end the siege, it now being taken over exclusively by the Bosnian Serb forces under the command of Ratko Mladic. However, this was little more than a political play by Milosevic in Belgrade, for he ordered that members of the JNA born outside of Bosnia to be withdrawn. The others would be transferred to Mladic's command. The last formal JNA troops in the city left just over 2 weeks before the UN moved into Sarajevo airport. The shelling of the population continued throughout this period, with only a brief pause on June 20th to allow the peacekeepers to take over the airport, which up until then had been under Serb control. On June 28th, French President Mitterrand became the first Western leader to visit the city and to see the devastation firsthand, his visit helping to highlight the plight of the population. With the world now more aware than ever of events taking place in the Balkans, there were growing calls for the Bosnian Serbs to lay down their heavier weapons and to surrender them to the UN peacekeepers. The Serbs were now firmly established in the world's eyes to be the villains in the story, and not without good reason. But this overshadowed crimes against humanity committed by both Bosnian Croat and Muslim troops, as well as the fact that this war seemed devoid of any rules. The arrival of UN troops complicated matters for the Serbs, who were forced to watch aircraft flying into the city, not only carrying aid for the very people they were trying to starve out, but also carrying the world's media, who continued reporting on the unfolding horrors. Images of the continuous shelling and sniping were being broadcast into millions of homes around the world, fueling calls for greater international intervention. On August 30th, 1992, shells landed in a crowded marketplace in the city, killing 13 people and wounding over 100 more, leading to international outrage. Then, on September 3rd, an Italian Air Force G222 transport aircraft with 4 service personnel was on approach to Sarajevo when it was fired upon by 2 shoulder-launched surface-to-air missiles. The infrared guided weapons homed in on the aircraft's turboprop engines, detonating close by and mortally damaging the aircraft. The Italian pilots trying desperately to wrestle back control, but to no avail, and it crashed into a hillside, killing all 4 on board. At first, it was naturally assumed that the Serbs were responsible, but subsequent investigations have led to accusations that it was in fact Bosnian Croat forces who were responsible, as the aircraft came down in territory some 17 miles from the city that they held at the time. Bosnian Croat forces this put a pause on airlift operations for a period of around a month, until transports from Britain, Canada, France, Germany and the US, fitted with sophisticated self-defense measures, re-established the air bridge. As a further precaution, they undertook a death-defying combat landing maneuver that became known as the Sarajevo Drop, in which they would approach the airfield at altitudes above the reach of the shoulder-launched SAMs and anti-aircraft guns, and then dive sharply towards the runway before leveling out at the last second and touching down. This maneuver significantly helped to reduce the risk from ground fire, but of course came with its own obvious risk if the pilots misjudged it. Further compounding the situation was a growing divide between the Bosnian Croats and the Bosniaks, the former of whom wanted to create a federation of Bosnia, Croatia and Herzegovina, the latter of which were opposed. Tensions mounted in the second half of 1992, until beginning in October, essentially a second war broke out for the future of the state of Bosnia-Herzegovina.
A real shooting took place behind Lucerno's. No cops showed up in person.
The new year seemed to offer no end to the fighting as the siege of Sarajevo continued. Several other towns and cities also found themselves under siege, where Serb forces were unable to march in and seize victory. But it was in the sparsely populated rural areas that the horrors were truly revealed. With further Serb gains in early 1993, the world was increasingly becoming aware of the concept of ethnic cleansing. It should be noted that the concept of ethnic cleansing differs from that of genocide, although Western media rarely makes the distinction in its reporting of the events taking place. The difference lays in that the primary goal of ethnic cleansing is the expulsion of a group of people from a geographical area, but not necessarily through the actual physical destruction of that group. Thousands of civilians therefore became displaced during the fighting, as they found themselves in territory now under the control of a different ethnic group. And again, this was carried out by all factions involved, although the Serbs were by far the most active in the process. For some though, such was the hatred by this time that the eradication of those not of the same religion or background was the only answer. The international community became aware of civilian deaths almost as soon as the fighting broke out in Bosnia, but reports were often confused concerning the details. During the fighting near Sijekovac in 1992, for example, Bosnian Serb authorities reported that as many as 59 Serb civilians were killed by Bosniak and Croat forces. However, whether these were intentional killings or not remains contested, with those the Serbs accused of carrying them out, claiming they were either killed unintentionally in the fighting or were even deliberately put in harm's way by the Serbs to discredit the government in Sarajevo. Regardless, reprisals took place and the stage was set for some of the worst atrocities since World War II to take place. Over 800 non-Serbs were killed in the ethnic cleansing of the Zvornik region, while over 1,000 were killed in the cleansing of Visegrad. The exact numbers remain debated, but it has been claimed that it could be as high as 3,000 people. In the latter case, the Bosnian Serbs introduced a terrifying new concept in the establishment of rape camps for captured women and girls, which would become part of the ethnic cleansing process, in that as well as being viewed as a source of cruel amusement to Serb troops, was also intended to breed out the existence of the Muslim population. In retaliation, Bosniak troops ambushed a number of JNA troops that were retreating peacefully as part of the agreement with Belgrade, and on July 12, 1992, murdered 69 Bosnian Serb fighters and civilians who tried to surrender to them. In order to limit the risk to civilians, on April 16, 1993, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 819, declaring the town of Srebrenica a safe area, free from armed attack or any other hostile act, enforced by UN peacekeeping troops who took responsibility for disarming anyone who wished to enter. The skies above Srebrenica was also declared a no-fly zone. The following month, this policy was extended to include Bihać, Gorazda, Žepa, Tuzla, and perhaps most notably Sarajevo, which was still under siege. UN forces established a tunnel connecting the airport to the city, where aid could be ferried through unobstructed. But even with the influx of military transport planes flying in food and medicine, in what would become the largest airlift in history, malnutrition and illness ran rampant among the besieged population, who still had to contend with intermittent shelling and sniping from Bosnian Serbs. With NATO countries providing much of the airlift capability and NATO Airborne Warning and Control System, or AWACS aircraft, monitoring air activity across the Balkans, the military alliance found itself being edged ever closer into the situation. Then, in mid-March 1993, a new dimension was added to the crisis. Several Bosniak and Croat villages found themselves under attack from the air by light aircraft and even fast jets. It was initially assumed that these were Yugoslavian Air Force jets under the command of Milosevic from the Serbian capital Belgrade. But later, it was established that Bosnian Serb forces or Serbian volunteers were operating them. In order to attack these villages, the aircraft routinely violated the no-fly zone around Srebrenica, and recognizing that if they went unchallenged, it would only embolden the Bosnian Serb pilots, who may even attack targets inside the safe zones in the future. The UN turned to NATO and requested they begin flying combat air patrols to enforce the zones. This resulted in Operation Deny Flight, which was instigated on March 2, 1993. The Bosnian Serbs themselves only had around 32 aircraft under their control in Bosnia, and these were mostly light types, and so were never considered a serious threat to NATO. The main concern for the NATO pilots involved came from surface-to-air missiles and the remnants of the Yugoslavian Air Force operating out of Serbia, who were equipped with advanced MiG-29A Fulcrum fighters, provided by the Soviet Union in the 1980s. There was also the issue of Serbs operating in Croatia from Udbina airfield, and whether or not NATO jets could pursue them back across the border into Croatia. Deny Flight got off to a rocky start when on the second day, a French Mirage 2000 fighter crashed into the Adriatic on a mission in support of the no-fly zone. Nevertheless, NATO's intervention continued with no fixed end date in place. The new Democrat government in Washington, under the very recently elected President Bill Clinton, along with the UN, hoped that this strong response, combined with the threat of retaliatory airstrikes should the bombing continue or NATO aircraft be attacked, might positively influence the efforts made towards peace. Clinton had actually included the unfolding tragedy in Bosnia in his election campaign in order to attack Bush's policy in the Balkans, and made it clear that he would authorize airstrikes if he felt that it was necessary. He therefore successfully lobbied the UN to authorize NATO's mission to be expanded to include close air support for UN peacekeepers should they find themselves under attack. This leading to Security Council Resolution 836 in June 1993. The resolution mandated, however, that NATO could not operate without UN authorization first, something that NATO leaders felt jeopardized the safety of the peacekeepers on the ground, who may need air support at just a moment's notice. This dual-key arrangement became an even greater issue when NATO, under pressure from Washington, began to plan for an air campaign to lift the siege of Sarajevo. This dual-key arrangement, the night flight, appeared to be succeeding in keeping Bosnian Serb attack aircraft out of the fighting, at least for the time being. Helicopters were another issue, as these could fly extremely low, making them difficult to detect on radar in the hilly terrain of Bosnia. When aircraft were detected in flight, the arrangement between NATO and the UN that required consensus for military action frustrated and delayed efforts to stop them. Further compounding the situation was the increase in hostility between the Bosniaks and the Bosnian Croat population, who had arranged themselves and their territory into a new state dubbed the Croatian Republic of Herzegovina. Throughout the remainder of 1993 and into 94, both groups conducted a number of seemingly tit-for-tat killings against one another. On October 23, 1993, Bosnian Croat troops murdered 31 Bosniak civilians in Stupni Do in central Bosnia, while Bosniak fighters killed 26 Croats in a massacre at Bohini Kut near Vitez on January 9, 1994, which prompted the Croats to retaliate with butchering 27 Bosniaks in Vitez over 2 weeks later. Under pressure from an escalation in the fighting with the Serbs, and championed by the US, a peace treaty was signed by Bosnian Prime Minister Haris Silajic, Croatian Foreign Minister Mate Granic, and the President of Herzegovina, Krešimir Zubac, on March 18, 1994, in Washington, D.C. This brought an end to the conflict that has since become known as the War Within a War, and under the agreement, the combined territory held by the Croats and Bosniak forces was divided into 10 autonomous cantons, establishing the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which aimed to prevent one party from gaining dominance over the other. On February 5, 1994, the situation would escalate when Serb forces deliberately fired into a marketplace in Sarajevo with a 122mm mortar, leading to 68 civilians being killed and 144 more being wounded. While blame was placed on Serb forces, at the time such was the confusion surrounding the event that Western investigators became torn over whether it was a deliberate act from Bosnian Serb leadership, a renegade act by members of the Bosnian Serb forces, or even if the Bosniaks did it themselves in order to provoke NATO into responding, believing the Serbs to be responsible. With this being a direct challenge to NATO and the UN, NATO was eager to respond, and with UN permission, they issued an ultimatum to the Bosnian Serbs surrounding the city that unless they withdrew their heavy weapons, they would face NATO's wrath. The Bosnian Serbs complied, and airstrikes were avoided. However, this was just the start of an increasingly turbulent and volatile year for all involved. Just over 3 weeks later, NATO and the UN were again directly challenged when on February 28, 1994, an AWACS operating as part of the Operation Deny Flight identified 8 aircraft undertaking a bombing mission against Novi Travnik in central Bosnia from Serb territory, violating the UN no-fly zone. F-16C Fighting Falcons of the US Air Force's 526th Fighter Squadron, the Black Knights, were dispatched to intercept them, downing 4 J-21 Jasreb light attack jets, while a 5th crashed later as a result of damage sustained in the engagement. This incident marked the first time NATO had ever fired weapons in anger against a target, but it would not be the last. In response, over a week later, Bosnian Serbs attacked a Spanish C-212 transport aircraft with a shoulder-launched SAM. But despite heavy damage, the crew skillfully managed to land the aircraft safely. As a result of these incidents, the Bosnian Serbs elected to again hold back their fixed-wing attack aircraft, and instead resorted to using helicopters to support the Republika Srpska troops. Controversially, they began painting some of these helicopters in UN colours, in order to avoid being fired upon by the Bosniaks or the Croat forces while they flew at ultra-low level to hide from the orbiting AWACS planes. Despite on April 10, 1994, the British commander of the UNPRO 4 troops in Gorazde, General Sir Michael Rose, formally requested NATO aircraft to provide close air support. Therefore, NATO undertook another first, when US Air Force F-16s, flying in response to this request, dropped bombs on a Serb command post. Bosnian Serb operations ceased for several hours as the Serbs analysed the scale of these airstrikes, before resuming their shelling of Gorazde. At the same time, Bosnian Serb leaders publicly accused NATO and the UN of dropping all pretense of being a humanitarian force, neutral in the fighting, and were now actively working against them. Serb General Ratko Mladic contacted General Rose directly and warned him that if any more airstrikes took place, that his forces would begin opening fire on NATO aircraft in the region. He also chillingly warned that he could not guarantee the safety of Rose's troops if he refused. And to make good on his word, he had his men surround 150 UN peacekeepers in the town, effectively taking them hostage. NATO ceased their operations temporarily in an effort to temper the situation, but within days were forced into action again. Such was the brutality of the fighting in this so-called UN safe zone. Mladic therefore ordered his men to start firing on NATO aircraft, damaging a French Navy attack jet on April 15th, before successfully bringing down a British Royal Navy Sea Harrier the next day, its pilot ejecting before being rescued. With the situation rapidly deteriorating, on April 20th, NATO agreed to extend air operations beyond close air support for UNPRO 4 troops, allowing the collapse of the Bosniak forces' main line defending Gorazde. Perhaps just as crucially for the Bosnian Serbs, their attack on Gorazde had angered the Russian government under Boris Yeltsin, who previously had been fairly warm to their cause. The NATO decision came with an ultimatum that the Bosnian Serbs withdraw their main force out to 3 kilometers from the center of Gorazde, while their heavy weapons were to be withdrawn to 20 kilometers away. However, while NATO was issuing this ultimatum, the UN was negotiating their own ceasefire with the Bosnian Serbs, and so vetoed the NATO request to begin airstrikes. Regardless of who deserved the credit, Bosnian Serb troops began pulling back on April 24th. But it was clear that the UN and NATO were still locking horns over how to conduct themselves in Bosnia. Meanwhile, UN troops continued to come under fire, with Danish forces at Tulsa airport being shelled on April 29th, prompting UN tanks to respond, killing 9 Serbs. Over the coming months, NATO aircraft continued undertaking precision airstrikes in support of UNPRO 4 troops, carefully orchestrated by the UN. Then in October, Bosniak and Bosnian Croat forces launched an offensive aimed at lifting the siege around the town of Bihać. Being so close to Serb-held territory in Croatia, the Serbs resumed the use of fixed-wing aircraft flying from Udbina to make high-speed attacks on Bosniak troops, and then fleeing across the border, knowing that NATO had no mandate to fly in what was Croatian airspace. This changed on November 19, 1994, when yet another UN resolution authorized NATO aircraft to extend air operations beyond the Balkans, if in support of UN troops in Bosnia. 2 days later, NATO bombed the base at Udbina, specifically targeting the runways rather than the aircraft or the infrastructure, hoping to deter further use of their aircraft. But it instead prompted Serb forces to again start targeting NATO aircraft with their surface-to-air missiles, and taking some 500 UN peacekeepers as hostages, causing NATO to again halt their strikes as a peace effort, led by former US President Jimmy Carter, aimed to safely secure their release during a 4-month-long ceasefire.
We are not the microwave.
The ceasefire allowed NATO and the UN to reassess their approach to the situation in Bosnia. Despite the military alliance's tactical superiority, they had been thwarted repeatedly by a combination of UN troops being used as shields and Serbian surface-to-air missiles targeting NATO aircraft. NATO, on its own volition, therefore began planning for a limited air campaign, designed to knock out the Serbs' air defense capability, leaving NATO aircraft free to fly uncontested.
We are not people
The plans were still being finalized when fighting between Bosniak and Serb troops renewed around Sarajevo in May 1995. After Serb forces seized a number of heavy weapons collected and stored by the UN peacekeepers within their safe zone, US Commander British Army Lieutenant General Rupert Smith requested airstrikes to destroy them, these being carried out by US and Spanish fighter bombers. Resulting to their tried and tested tactics, 377 UN peacekeepers were again taken hostage, forcing NATO to suspend its strikes, while negotiations took place for their release. Following this incident, UN peacekeepers began adopting more defensible positions, while General Rose, himself a former member of the SAS, created a UN Rapid Reaction Force with much more lenient rules of engagement in order to respond to further efforts of taking hostages, and thus to protect the peacekeepers. In the meantime, NATO aircraft continued their patrols as part of denied flight. On June 2nd, 1995, a US Air Force F-16, flown by Captain Scott O'Grady, who had also been present in the air battle the year earlier, was shot down by an SA-6 surface-to-air missile near Mirkonic Gradin in Serb-controlled territory. O'Grady ejected and would spend 6 days evading Serb forces who wanted to take him hostage. During this time, US commanders demanded retaliatory strikes, but with the Serbs still holding hostages, these were seen as unfeasible lest the Serbs begin executing them. In the end, O'Grady was rescued by a force of US Marines, significantly de-escalating the situation and allowing for the release of the hostages to continue. O'Grady's story would later inspire the movie Behind Enemy Lines. Although they had suffered NATO's wrath several times by this point, the Bosnian Serb leadership felt emboldened enough to launch an attack on another UN safe zone, specifically Srebrenica. The town of Srebrenica was protected by a predominantly Dutch force of UN peacekeepers, who were relatively lightly armed themselves, and so relied on the protection of NATO aircraft if they ever came under attack. In the summer of 1995, Srebrenica was a name that had largely dropped off the pages of newspapers, despite reports of civilians starving within the town's boundaries. As a Dutch report, published 15 years later, put it, quote, Srebrenica was situated in eastern Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was geographically and mentally far removed from Sarajevo and Zagreb. The rest of the world was focused on the fight for Sarajevo and the peace process. As a safe area, Srebrenica only occasionally managed to attract the attention of the world press or the UN Security Council. That is why the Dutch troops there remained of secondary importance in operational and logistic terms for so long, and why the importance of the enclave in the battle for domination between the Bosnian Serbs and the Bosnian Muslims failed to be recognized for so long. End quote. The Dutch troops stationed in the town couldn't fail to notice the deteriorating situation as aid convoys became prevented from reaching the enclave. With hunger and the constant fear of shelling or sniper fire from the Bosnian Serbs in the surrounding areas, rather than being a safe haven, the population who still had strength resorted to violence or prostitution in order to feed themselves and their families with what little food there was left. And just as desperate with the lack of regular medical supplies. With UN or NATO troops forbidden from directly intervening, Bosniak government forces attacked the Serb lines in June in the hope of redirecting the efforts away from the town. This effort failed, and on July 6, 1995, the Bosnian Serbs attacked the UN safe zone. They quickly overran the Dutch observation posts, the peacekeepers either retreating or surrendering to the Serb forces, who began the process of ethnically cleansing the houses on the southern front. Despite being outnumbered by the Dutch and the Bosniak troops defending the enclave, the Bosnian Serbs enjoyed both considerable success and a lack of general interest from the international community, who were more focused on the political effort to bring a lasting peace than what was viewed then as just another brushfire in the ongoing war. It would not be until July 11th that NATO planes went into action to stop the Serb advances, but once again, the Bosnian Serbs threatened to kill the Dutch and French peacekeepers that they had taken hostage, forcing the strikes to stop once again. The bombing stopped almost as quickly as it began, and that night, the Serbs took the town, and with them, the civilian population of UN disarmed Bosniaks. As many as 25,000 Bosniak refugees sought shelter at the Dutch command post at Potocari, but the facility was too small to house them, forcing them to simply congregate around it. Dutch soldiers watched helplessly as the Bosnian Serb troops randomly murdered boys and men and gang-raped women and girls, before on the morning of July 12th, they began separating the men from the women. Over the following days, atrocities would be carried out that seemed savage even by medieval standards, as the disorganized violence against the Bosniak civilians morphed into a coordinated effort to kill thousands of them. While the main focus was put on men who were of military age, young boys and the elderly were systematically killed, as were a number of the women. Some of the population tried to flee into the woods and join up with Bosniak troops, which led to the Serbs launching a large-scale search looking for them. Prisoners were rarely taken when they were found. In all, some 8,372 people were butchered. Both the UN and NATO came under intense pressure for their part in allowing the massacre to take place, relatively unchallenged. And so, as the Bosnian Serbs continued their mopping up actions around the blood-soaked town, 16 nations met for a conference in London on July 21st, 1995, to consider new options for dealing with the situation in Bosnia. As a result of the conference, UN Secretary-General Boutros Boutros-Ghali gave UN peacekeeping troops free rein to call in NATO airstrikes if they found themselves under attack. Furthermore, NATO was authorized to take punitive actions if any more safe zones came under attack. NATO's earlier plan to neutralize Serb air defenses soon evolved into a much broader one, and it was to be dubbed Deliberate Force. Thus, when on August 28, 1995, 37 people were killed by yet another mortar strike on a marketplace in Sarajevo, NATO was given the go-ahead to implement it, and on August 30th, the first of an armada of over 400 combat aircraft flying from bases in Italy and carriers in the Adriatic filled the skies over Bosnia, striking targets with precision-guided munitions.
Yes, we have many wheels.
15 NATO nations contributed aircraft to the operation, including Tornado reconnaissance aircraft from Germany, this being the Luftwaffe's first combat operation since 1945, something that was used by the Serbs to stir up hatred against NATO by evoking memories of Nazi occupation. It would also see the first operational deployment of the MQ-1 Predator drone, one of which would be lost to ground fire. Additional ground forces were deployed from Britain, France and Holland to support the air campaign, these numbering in the region of 4,000 troops, who brought with them various artillery pieces with which to bombard Bosnian Serb positions. As the deliberate force began, NATO issued an ultimatum for Bosnian Serb heavy weapons to be withdrawn from Sarajevo, but this time it was ignored, and NATO forces began directly involved in lifting the siege. The Bosnian Serb forces attempted to respond and succeeded in shooting down a French Mirage 2000M strike aircraft with a shoulder-launched surface-to-air missile, with the pilots ejecting but being taken prisoner. But NATO's firepower was overwhelming. By September 14th, 1,026 bombs had been dropped onto Bosnian Serb positions, and with NATO now protecting UN troops more closely, there was little they could do except to comply with NATO's demands to withdraw. Deliberate Force was judged a success and therefore suspended, but deny flight operations continued. During early September, while much of the world's attention was focused on images of NATO's advanced air power taking off to strike at Bosnian Serb targets, on the ground the Bosnian Serbs were also having to contend with a renewed offensive by Bosniak and Croat forces. Following the cessation of Deliberate Force, it was clear that things in Bosnia had changed markedly, and so with Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic speaking on their behalf, the Bosnian Serbs agreed to peace talks to be held in Dayton, Ohio, this being designed to deliberately take all sides in the talks out of their comfort zones. Beginning on November 1st, Milosevic met with Bosnian President Alija Izetbegovic and Croatian President Franjo Tuđman, and also representatives from the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, Russia, and the European Union at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The negotiations, led by Chief US Negotiator Richard Holbrooke, would take 3 weeks and were anything but smooth, the Bosniak delegation proving especially difficult to keep on board given how much their people had suffered. The negotiations resulted in a plan, dubbed the General Framework Agreement for Peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which preserved Bosnia as a single state made up of two parts, the Bosniak-Croat Federation and the Bosnian Serb Republic, with Sarajevo remaining as the undivided capital city. Additionally, the agreement required all members to fully respect the sovereign equality of one another, and to settle future disputes by peaceful means. This being especially important given the immense refugee crisis as a result of both the war and the ethnic cleansing. It was also demanded that all parties cooperate in the investigation of human rights violations and war crimes, something that would prove highly contentious in the months after the agreement was formally signed in Paris on December 14th, bringing the fighting to an end. The Bosnian War cost an estimated 100,000 lives, and would see almost 2.5 million people displaced from their homes. It was a war of medieval brutality and space-age technology. It simultaneously highlighted both the success and failings of the United Nations as an entity in the new post-Cold War order, it being left open to both praise and criticism regarding how it conducted itself. With the threat of World War III seemingly confined to the history books, many Western forces reoriented their strategies concerning defense in the wake of the Bosnian intervention, believing that peacekeeping would be the primary focus from then on, particularly as the Dayton Peace Accords required a 60,000-strong implementation force to guarantee the peace. However, peace was far from long-lasting for the countries that once made up Yugoslavia. In 1999, NATO would again be in action in the region, this time directly against Serbia as Kosovo fought for its independence. In this instance, NATO took the dramatic step of carrying out the bombing without UN approval on humanitarian grounds, as it became clear that Russia and China would veto any resolution authorizing the strikes. While NATO proved successful, the lack of UN support brought into question the campaign's legitimacy, and perhaps more importantly, highlighted the UN Security Council's near impotence when faced with the US, something that would become an even greater issue when facing the war on terror. Thanks again to Call of War for sponsoring today's video. Click on the link in the description to choose your nation and find your victory, with an exclusive gift of 13,000 gold and a free month subscription on Premium.
This program documents D-Day in the words of its veterans. It features rare archival footage.
Good evening. It was a scene right out of an action-packed Hollywood movie. Bloody gun battle between cops and robbers on the streets of suburban Los Angeles today.
He must have fired over 500 rounds. I mean, unbelievable. It was like a war zone, and he just kept doing it, and the cops were all pinned down. One of them was bleeding pretty bad.
Guys walked in, they looked like they were RoboCop. I mean, they were so heavily armed, and they looked dangerous.
The one weapon that we've identified can go through a bulletproof vest at 200 yards.
These are very organized, brutal bank robbery suspects. They're killers.
See you later, HE.
The North Hollywood Shootout. It is the story of a bank robbery that went very, very wrong. A surrealist holdup worthy of a movie scene, or should I say, worthy of an open-world video game. What happened in Los Angeles on the morning of February 28, 1997, was actually real. That day, two stout and heavily armed men decided to carry out an extremely brutal robbery, a completely botched theft that would soon turn into a huge shooting. Two robbers against almost 400 policemen, including SWAT members, all in the middle of Los Angeles and broadcasted live on television. With an impressive arsenal of illegally modified guns, the two robbers will indeed shoot anything that moves to try to get away from the crime scene. Civilians or policemen, nobody is safe from the armor-piercing bullets coming from everywhere. Some of their war weapons shoot 10 bullets per second, a simply staggering and insane firepower for a bank robbery. On the other side, the police, having only handguns and shotguns with a weak range to compete with, try to keep the bandits at bay. But the bullets they shoot only tickle them, because, adding to their war weapons, the robbers also are equipped with bulletproof protection from head to toe. Larry Phillips Jr. and Emil Matasaran are the two who were behind this insane robbery. Two guys keen on guns and bodybuilding who met at the gym in 1989 to then form a friendship rooted in hatred of society. Two determined robbers who didn't seem to be afraid of death and who, during almost an hour, spread a climate of terror in Los Angeles. We still don't know whether they came to rob a bank or make war. What is sure, they committed one of the most brutal robberies in history. So brutal that it is known today under the name of the North Hollywood Shootout.
She's only been clear all the way around.
I am a tactical asset computer system.
Thinking back to bank robberies in the USA, we think of the 1930s and the era of the John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, Pretty Boy Floyd, and Bonnie and Clyde. A period in American history where armed robbery was flourishing. The Great Depression struck the US hard, creating an atmosphere of economic distress that led more and more people to turn to robbery. As a result, the number of bank robberies increased dramatically, to the point where some people refer to these years as the golden age of bank robbery. But fortunately, this trend was put on hold after a while, and the following decades were, shall we say, rather quiet in terms of armed robbery. The authorities had managed to put a stop to this incredible rise in crime, and we thought it was all a thing of the past. But not at all, since bank robberies would make a resurgence from the 1960s onwards, more precisely between 1965 and 1975, when armed robberies climbed from 850 to almost 3,500 per year. A spectacular rise, you may say, but it didn't stop there. Yes, because the trend continued into the 70s and 80s, with 5,500 robberies in 1985 alone. The curve then kept climbing, reaching even more insane figures in the following decade, with almost 7,900 robberies in 1990 and 9,388 the year after. A real epidemic of armed robbery, with its epicenter in the far west of the United States, Los Angeles, the city that has become known as the national capital of bank robbery. An unenviable title, we may say. When it comes to attracting tourists, we've seen better. But believe me, the City of Angels deserved this distinction. In fact, you only have to look at crime rates at the time to understand. Remember when I told you that 1991 recorded over 9,300 robberies? Well, a quarter of that staggering figure came from Los Angeles County alone. Yep, 2,355 robberies in that single year. Worse, it's not even the highest total the city has ever recorded, because we still have 1992, when the peak was reached this time, with 2,641 armed robberies. That's roughly 7 bank robberies a day, or 1 every working hour. Just imagine. Moreover, there were so many of them in the 80s and 90s that Hollywood took an interest in the phenomenon, producing some of the greatest bank robbery films set in Southern California. Point Break, actually, released in 1991, and above all, the benchmark in bank robbery films, released in 1995, Heat. At the time, Los Angeles was suffering from an ever-increasing number of robberies. If the rates were alarming, what was even more so was the brutal violence with which gangsters operated during these armed robberies. Most of them were equipped as if they were going to war. Machine guns, assault rifles, bulletproof vests. It seemed that with this new wave of robbers, the end justified the means, and nothing could stop them from stealing the loot they had set their sights on. So much so, in fact, that some thought that if they had to kill, they would. What turned bank robberies into recurrently violent operations in Los Angeles was that famous robbery on September 5th, 1991. On this particular day, two men, members of a bank robbery gang well known to the police as the West Hills Bandits, enter a Wells Fargo branch in the Tarzana district of Los Angeles. Heavily armed and wearing masks, they paradoxically demonstrate a disconcerting civility when it comes to robbery. They gather customers and employees together, telling them quite naturally,
"Enjoy the show."
In less than 2 minutes, the establishment is robbed. True professionals, there was no doubt about it, and courteous too, since as they left the premises, they gave the hostages a cheerful,
"Thanks, everyone."
The two robbers left thrilled, with quite a haul in their pockets. $437,000, a record loot for the Los Angeles jurisdiction at the time, which would, alas, be mistakenly revealed to the general public by a bank employee, because it was from that moment on that things really took a turn for the worse. For among those tipped off were some of the city's criminals who were already licking their chops when they heard how much had been stolen. They now had proof that it was possible to make large sums of money by robbing banks in Los Angeles. Such was the case with Robert Sheldon Brown, aka Casper, a prominent member of the Crips gang, who figured that robberies might indeed be a good business idea. Within weeks, he sent dozens of armed teenage gangs to rob the city's banks. These kids, often as young as 13, would wreak havoc on any bank they passed. Unlike the West Hills Bandits, who were polite and meticulous, these kids were nervous, undisciplined, and above all, extremely violent. The baby bandits, as the FBI came to call them, would appear in the banks firing bursts of bullets at the ceiling, when it wasn't at themselves or their accomplices. When they attacked, no one was spared. Sometimes tellers were needlessly beaten with rifle butts, or hostage customers had their wedding rings brutally ripped from their fingers by the baby bandits. So of course, their amateurism disserved them, to the point where they were captured in droves by the authorities. But the more they were captured, the more Casper sent new ones. Teenage gangsters were a common sight, and Casper was never short-staffed. So, thanks to his army of baby bandits, he was able to commit over 175 robberies, more than any other person in U.S. history, and not take part in any of them. If Los Angeles earned the title of bank robbery capital in the 90s, you can be sure it was largely due to him, just like the sudden rise in violence committed during these same holdups at the time. And even though Robert Sheldon Brown would later be arrested, others would follow in his footsteps, like these two young men, who had no doubt watched too much Heat, and who in turn tried their hand at bank robbery with equally extreme and gratuitous violence. Two guys who were none other than Larry Phillips Jr. and Emil Matasareanu, the perpetrators of the North Hollywood shootout.
See you later 104 radio program.
We're in the mid-90s, and the heyday of armed robbery seems to be over. The number of robberies in Los Angeles is drastically dropping, from 2,641 during the peak of 1992 to 749 the following year. The main reason? The leader of the baby bandits was under arrest in 1993. This arrest gave the LA police a breath, at least until 1996, when another group of robbers appeared. The duo we're interested in, featuring Larry Phillips Jr. and Emil Matasareanu. But let's take a step back in time to get an understanding of who these two men were. Larry Phillips Jr., of Mexican and Italian descent, was born on September the 20th, 1970, in Los Angeles, into a family not like any other. His father, Larry Phillips Sr., had several run-ins with the law during his life, which didn't make his son's childhood any easier. It is said that it was his father who encouraged Larry Phillips Jr. to take the road of delinquency by projecting onto him his hatred of police officers. According to Larry Phillips Sr., this hatred began on his son's 6th birthday, when FBI agents came to his house, guns drawn, to arrest him. He said,
Larry hated cops because of what they did to me. He knew that every time I came into contact with police, something bad happened.
Another version says that the father would also have influenced his son during mountain trips, which would have created in Larry an aversion to law enforcement, a hatred that would follow him all his life. Later, his parents divorced, and Larry lived with his mother, even though his father continues to see him and plays a role in his life, taking him to try his hand at firearms at shooting ranges. These sessions instilled in the young man a real passion for weapons. At 13, he dropped out of school. Yes, because what interests Larry most is money. He wants to get rich quick, and he's determined to do it by following in the footsteps of his idols, some of whom were big names in white-collar crime. According to Larry's half-brother, he was motivated by nothing more than money and power.
Larry wanted to live the American dream, but he decided to go about it the wrong way. He idolized the wrong people.
Then came the inevitable. On September 2nd, 1989, Larry committed his first crime, a theft of $400 worth of suits, for which he was arrested and tried, and which brought him a 3-day stay at the police station. As the months went on, he found himself in legal trouble again, this time because of illegal real estate activities, fraud to be precise, a crime for which he will be sentenced again. But Larry doesn't seem to learn his lesson and keeps on persevering. His thirst for wealth, coupled with the resentment of society's rules, only grows. Sometimes he would take his half-brother to the richest parties of the city to motivate him, as he put it. In particular, he would tell him,
"Why don't you visualize yourself in that house? The reason is, society tells you you have to do a 9-to-5 job until you retire at 65.
Wealth is what drove Larry Phillips Jr. A bit like bodybuilding, another of his passions that he practiced diligently and which led him to meet the second protagonist of the North Hollywood shootout, Emil Matasareanu. Gold's Gym in Venice Beach is where Larry and Emil first met. Larry, a bodybuilding enthusiast, has been dreaming of becoming the new Arnold Schwarzenegger since he was a teenager. So he puts his heart and soul into it, reading a plethora of books on the subject and training regularly. Unfortunately, not everyone can become a bodybuilding star. Genetics playing a large part, Larry realizes that his dream will remain forever out of reach and puts an end to his ambition to become Mr. Olympia. This disillusionment doesn't prevent him from remaining disciplined in his training. However, Larry continues to attend Gold's Gym until the day he meets another regular who is also passionate about bodybuilding and firearms. Emil Matasareanu, of Romanian origin, was born in Timișoara, Romania, on July 19, 1966. He was the only son of parents who decided to leave Europe in the mid-1970s and settle in the United States in Los Angeles. Like Larry, Emil had a difficult childhood, but for different reasons. His classmates regularly mocked him for his Romanian accent and for being overweight. This constant harassment prompted him to spend much of his time at home in front of his computer. During this period, he developed a passion for firearms. He managed to make a few friends, but never kept them for very long. He was a socially maladjusted young man, as his mother describes him. At home, tensions flare as Emil's parents begin to argue more and more. Divorce was around the corner, but Emil seemed to be coping with the situation for the time being. He continued his studies, taking a 3-year course in electronic engineering, graduating in 1987. Sometime later, he opened his own IT business. His mother wanted him to continue his studies, but he was determined to enter the business world and start earning money. His parents' recurring quarrels and pressure he was under gradually weighed on him, leading to a series of temper tantrums, such as the time he threw a chainsaw in his neighbor's face because his dog had dared to walk on their lawn. Computers and guns are no longer enough to relieve Emil's stress, and neighbors often see him on the front porch, cleaning his guns. The need to channel his anger leads him to another passion, which initially causes him to lose over 100 pounds, but also leads him to meet his future partner in crime, Larry. The story takes place in 1989 at Gold's Gym in Venice Beach, Los Angeles. Emil, who trains there regularly, meets a man who will dramatically change his life. A young man who, like him, enjoys lifting weights and guns, who will soon embark with him on a frenzied crime spree. Yes, because it's Larry who's clearly going to emerge as the leader in this new friendship, to the point where he manipulates Emil psychologically, because according to Larry's half-brother, Emil was just a follower in the group.
You can't imagine how manipulative my brother was. He tried to break your mind down and then build it up again so that you would become one of his crew.
This is how Larry controlled every aspect of Emil Mătăsăreanu's life. He most likely told him about his resentment towards the police and society, and even went so far as to influence his choice of spouse. Emil had indeed returned to Romania in the early 1990s to bring his grandmother to the United States. He then used the opportunity to bring back a Romanian woman, whom he later married. Larry, for his part, was with a Hispanic woman. So it was this friendship that triggered the events that unfolded in North Hollywood on February 28, 1997. An ordinary friendship, but one that would soon turn into a murderous agreement. Los Angeles was clearly not ready for what was to come.
108. Texas 29509563 29
October 23, 1993, Glendale, Los Angeles County. Larry Phillips Jr. and Emil Mătăsăreanu, driving a red Ford Thunderbird, leave a gas station at high speed. Just then, Ian Grimes, a nearby police sergeant, spots them and immediately gives chase.
You are not Heath.
Having succeeded in stopping them, the officer then asks them a few routine control questions. Faced with the officer's questions, Larry seems reluctant to answer. Worse, Emil lies to the officer, saying that the car belongs to Larry's mother, even though they had rented it at an airport. Emil should have known that before arresting them, the policeman would have asked for a license plate check, which of course he later did. Faced with Larry's hesitation and his friend's attempt at deception, Officer Grimes senses that something is fishy. So he invites Larry to get out of the car and join him in the back to check him out. And what does he find? A gun. The agent's suspicion grows and grows. He immediately calls for reinforcements, and when they open the trunk, surprise, he and his colleagues discover a whole arsenal of weapons, including assault rifles, machine guns, explosive devices, bulletproof vests, smoke bombs, enough to leave the police speechless. Had Larry and Emil been speeding to a safe house to hide all this equipment? It's possible. What's certain is that they couldn't have gone far now that the officers had arrested them. Larry and Emil were identified by the police and sentenced to prison for conspiracy to commit robbery, for which they each spent about 100 days in jail. They serve their respective sentences, then are released onto the streets of Los Angeles with a large part of their arsenal in their possession. Of course, they don't learn their lesson and get ready to commit their first robbery. Their first armed robbery was a van holdup that took place in broad daylight on June 14, 1995, in the Winnetka district of Los Angeles. It was 12:25 a.m. when the two men, wearing hoods and carrying assault rifles, held up a Brinks armored car. Inside were two security guards, including Herman Cook, a 51-year-old father of two.
Get down! Don't look!
Orders one of the bandits to the pedestrians before taking action. The extremely brutal robbery began with the barrage of shots fired without warning at the armored car, in full view of a dozen witnesses. The bandits didn't even give the security guards a chance to hand over the money, simply opening fire on them without warning. Using their automatic assault rifles with armor-piercing bullets, they gave Herman Cook no chance, and he died under fire, shot at point-blank range. $122,500 was the loot that Larry Phillips and Emil Matasareanu had taken that day, at the cost of a man's life. Even the reward offered for their capture would prove greater than the amount they stole that day. March 27, 1996, 9 months later. Larry and Emil attack another armored car with an equally direct and brutal modus operandi. They were in a van when one of them, on the passenger side, shot through the windshield of a Brinks van coming towards them in the opposite direction. One of the agents inside is slightly wounded by shards of glass, but this is not enough to stop the vehicle carrying the money, as it speeds off to escape the assailants. Larry and Emil turn back to try and catch up with it, but are unable to do so. It's their first big failure. To erase the evidence, they set fire to their van before changing vehicles and fleeing. The scene is eerily reminiscent of the film Heat, released a month earlier. May 2nd, 1996. The duo followed up with another armed robbery. Gone were the armored vans. Now they decided to take the plunge and hit the banks. Their first target? A Bank of America branch in the Van Nuys district of Los Angeles. It was shortly before 10 o'clock a.m. when the two robbers, armed with automatic rifles, burst into the establishment and fired a dozen shots into the ceiling. Inside, some 30 people were taken hostage, including several children, terrified by what was happening. Some of them were crying, which soon irritated the two men, who threatened to kill them if their mothers didn't make them stop crying. Larry and Emil have absolutely no scruples. All they care about is money, and that day, they're going to get a lot of it, over $755,000. Then, on May 31st, 1996, it's the same old story. Larry and Emil attacked a second Bank of America branch, not far from where they robbed the armored car that had claimed Herman Cook's life a year before. The robbery began at 10:05 a.m., with the same modus operandi as earlier in the month. This time, however, they left two injured tellers in their wake. The amount stolen was even greater than the previous one, almost $800,000, giving them a total of almost $1.5 million in the space of 30 days. The investigators had been warned. For the first time, they could see the two robbers they were looking for through the surveillance cameras. Two hooded robbers with imposing, intimidating builds, walking slowly, assault rifles in hand. An atypical bank robber profile, and what especially jumps out at the FBI agents is the time taken by the duo to pull off the two robberies. 6 minutes for the first and 8 for the second, which is an eternity for bank robberies. In fact, it's as if they don't seem to be in any hurry when it comes to robbing, always keeping the same pace, even during the getaway. As if, in the end, it wasn't robbery itself that animated them, but the possible armed confrontation with the authorities. Maybe that was what they wanted to do, after all. Well, if it was, they were in for a treat. Yeah, because we finally arrived at the holdup we're interested in. The one that will soon pit Larry Phillips Jr. and Emil Matasareanu against an armada of police officers in the middle of Los Angeles. The North Hollywood shootout was just around the corner.
We are not the microwave radio on that bus. See you later, Walmart.
February 28, 1997, Los Angeles. That morning, in the City of Angels, the weather was mild and clement. The blue sky over the city suggests a pleasant, sunny day. Just another winter's morning, you might say, for the residents of North Hollywood, who have no idea that their neighborhood will soon be the scene of one of the most violent urban shootouts in history. On Laurel Canyon Boulevard, two men in a white Chevrolet with heavily tinted windows speed down the road towards a bank in the North Hollywood neighborhood. Larry Phillips Jr. and Emil Mataseranu are ready for their next big heist. With them is an impressive arsenal, including several illegally modified weapons of war. Their tactical vests are overflowing with ammunition clips. Larry is carrying almost 20 kilograms of gear, including homemade bulletproof protection, which covers him from head to toe. Emil, more lightly equipped, takes only a metal ballistic plate to protect his vital organs. Sometime earlier, they had swallowed tranquilizers to reduce the stress of going into action. 9:11 a.m., the duo gradually approached their target, a Bank of America branch in North Hollywood. The car parks, but surprisingly, the robbers position it facing the wall. A curious strategy, given that parking in reverse would have enabled them to escape more quickly. No matter, the robbery is about to begin. Larry and Emil put on their hoods and sunglasses. Larry does a quick check on the police scanner, which he illegally possesses, and then it's off. It's 9:17 a.m. when the two men exit the vehicle, one after the other. Their watches are set to 8 minutes, the time they estimate before the police intervene. They head for the bank entrance. Their bodybuilder stature combined with the heavy equipment they're wearing make them look like two intimidating monsters about to terrify the world.
Okay, motherfucker, let's go.
The robbery begins when Larry orders one of the bank's customers to enter the establishment. Two policemen standing near the bank witness the surreal scene.
5840, requesting assistance. We have a possible 211 in progress at the Bank of America. Bank of America, located north of Corpus. We have shots fired.
The robbery had barely begun, but the alert had already been given. Unaware of this, Larry and Emil carry on with their robbery.
This is a fucking holdup.
Then, putting their money where their mouths are, the two of them strafe the ceiling of the bank. The 30 or so employees and customers present at the Bank of America that morning are terrified. It doesn't take long for LAPD patrol cars to arrive at the scene of the crime. Inside the bank, Larry ensures that all the hostages remain motionless. 30 men, women, and children lie on the floor, terrified by the criminal who roams the room, threatening to kill anyone who dares challenge his authority. Meanwhile, Emil is busy collecting the money. He then hits a 79-year-old lady who doesn't obey quickly enough with a backhand to the head, then fires a dozen shots at the security door of the ticket office. The door blown open, Emil then heads into the private part of the bank, where the vault and other employees are located.
Get the money, or we will kill you.
Among the employees is the bank's deputy manager, who holds the keys to the vault. Seeing the robber's determination, he gives him access without resisting. This doesn't stop Emil from whacking him over the head with a rifle butt. Once inside the vault, Emil gets more and more upset. The deputy manager unlocks secure boxes containing only small bundles. The bandit's big black bag isn't filling up fast enough for his liking. They had planned on a haul of $750,000, and all they get back is barely half of that, just over $300,000. Emil stares angrily at his hostage and repeatedly asks him to take out more money. Alas, that's all the bank had at the time. An ominous silence falls. Suddenly, the disgruntled robber fires his assault rifle into the ceiling of the vault.
Everybody stay down. The rapid automatic fires are panning the area with fire.
For his part, Larry continued to watch the hostages, moving from one side of the bank lobby to another, when he noticed something strange outside. Not a single car was in sight. Larry goes out to investigate and scans the area. He sees a police car parked on his right, but no more concerned than that, he returns to the bank undisturbed.
Nobody look at me, or I will kill you.
Larry then lashes out at the hostages and fires his AK-47. By this time, the police have surrounded the bank. Taking cover behind their vehicles, they're ready for the criminals. Or so they think. As it turns out, their handguns and short-range shotguns will be ineffective. Back in the bank, Emil and Larry are disappointed. The loot of $303,305 is clearly not enough. But the clock is ticking and the police are pouring in.
advised, I got 2 witnesses over here say there's possibly 2 or 3 suspects inside, possible AK-47s, or wearing ski masks and dark clothing.
Confrontation seems inevitable. Future chaos is on the horizon, and it doesn't help that the cops haven't had enough time to clear the area of civilians. Yes, because many people are still walking around the area. For the robbers, it's time to plan their exit. Larry orders the security guard to take all the hostages to the vault. Then the 2 men head for the exit door, where the police are waiting. With their war weapons and multiple bulletproof protections, the upcoming confrontation is already shaping up to be a tense one. 9:24 a.m. Larry Phillips is the first to emerge from the building. He points his assault rifle at the police vehicles and opens fire.
Question help at the bank. Stay down. The suspects are shooting AK-47s. Stay down. America, stay down. Automatic fire.
The deafening sound of the bullets echoed throughout the neighborhood. Police officers and civilians dived to the ground in order to avoid the piercing bullets from the automatic rifles. The cars they were hiding behind were pierced like paper, some bullets even flying out the other side of the bodywork. More than 200 rounds were fired by Larry. He then retreated into the bank. The first hail of bullets had already wounded several people, including 2 civilians. Then, at 9:30 a.m., Larry reappeared, this time accompanied by Emil, who is carrying the bag of money. The bursts of gunfire resume, but more intensely. John Caparelli, a police officer present that day, remembers,
"A single fully automatic AK-47 makes a whole lot of noise, but when Matasariano joined his cohort in the lobby, the sound of 2 became the stuff of nightmares. It was the Devil's Symphony, and something that stayed with me even to this day."
The hail of bullets hit many police officers, including one who was shot in the thigh, shattering his femur. For the police officers present, it's almost impossible to fight back. The 2 robbers had far too superior weapons at their disposal. An observation shared by Constable Caparelli, who recalls,
"We were in big trouble. Compared to their firepower, we had pea shooters, and the rounds were literally bouncing right off them. With our firepower not having much effect, the idea came to go to a nearby gun store."
Larry and Emil seemed invincible, yet 2 policemen managed to inflict the first damage, wounding Larry Phillips. Located some 200 meters from the robber, one of the policemen took a huge risk by going out into the open to shoot the robber in the back. He fired twice, wounding Larry in the back and buttock. The robber staggers, then turns around in rage, spraying the policeman with armor-piercing bullets that wound him and his partners. The situation is becoming more and more tense. Larry and Emil keep on firing at anything that moves, policemen or civilians. No one is spared.
The suspects are out and they're shooting at everything. Now those areas cannot see.
The robbers then want to secure their loot. To do so, Emil fires continuously to cover his sidekick, who heads for the car with a money bag containing 3 anti-theft devices. Suddenly, the system activates and explodes, covering all the wads of cash in red ink. Larry and Emil could kiss their 300 grand goodbye. The confrontation goes on, and surprisingly, the 2 bandits don't seem to want to run away. Indeed, they go so far as to attempt to break into an automatic teller machine outside the bank. Seemingly in no hurry, Larry strolls quietly past the bank, shooting anything that moves, including news helicopters broadcasting the shootout live on TV.
We've just been informed that the suspect is shooting at our helicopter and the other helicopters, so I'm going to try to keep a picture with you, but we are being shot at this time.
Let me go higher.
For Emil Matasuranu, things are more complicated. Hit by several bullets, including one that tore off his eyebrow, he was in a state of shock and put himself out of action by sitting down in the passenger seat of the car.
The suspect is walking along the east side of the bank. He's just daring people to come after him. He's got additional weapons. The trunk is open on his vehicle. Could be out 10 and somebody has a shot. Take it. Suspect's head.
At this point, they could very well have taken their car and sped off, but no. Instead, they continue to confront the authorities. No doubt Larry, who had a tenacious hatred of cops, took great pleasure in shooting at the police. and since he was the leader of the duo, Emil probably followed him. At one point, however, we see Emil trying to convince his accomplice to leave. Passing to the driver's side, he opens the passenger door to signal to his accomplice that it's time to leave. But Larry doesn't seem to mind, and closes the door with a sweep of his hip, as if to say,
I still want to have some fun.
A scene which shows that his partner may have intended to put an end to the bloodshed. Because yes, it's possible that Emil heard on his radio scanner the arrival of SWAT, who are on their way to help the police.
50L10, we need someone here with some heavy guns. We need SWAT code 3.
And confronting SWAT was another matter. In an attempt to convince Larry of the necessity to leave, Emil stepped on the gas pedal and slowly drove the Chevrolet towards the north exit of the parking lot.
Suspects on the north side of the building. It's walking around like nothing. They got AK-47s, 2 of them, they're dressed in all black, heavy body armor.
Larry follows on foot and continues to shoot at the targets around him.
Intercept prospect vehicle, do not stop it. They've got automatic weapons. There's nothing we have that can stop them.
After that, he takes cover behind a semi-trailer, while Emil, still driving the car, seems to be waiting for him to get away once and for all. Except that Larry is unwilling to answer his calls, busy repairing his gun, which has jammed in the meantime. That's when a police officer, positioned right in front of the trailer, sees Emil Mătăsăreanu and starts shooting. The bullet passes through the driver's window and just a few centimeters from Mătăsăreanu's face. Startled, Mătăsăreanu hits the gas pedal and pulls hard on the steering wheel, practically lying down on the front seats to avoid the shots. Larry is now alone. Kneeling in the back of the truck, he still tries to unblock his gun, in vain. Officer Caparelli, stationed up the street from Larry, handgun in hand and exposed, fires at the assailant, then quickly escapes to avoid the Kalashnikov bursts. What he doesn't know is that Larry's gun is jammed, preventing the robber from firing back. Agent Caparelli continued to shoot at Larry, who began to flinch. A bullet hits him in the right clavicle artery, severing it and causing a severe wound. In response, Larry pulled out his Beretta pistol and counterattacked, when suddenly another policeman hit him on the right hand, causing him to drop his pistol. He picks it up from the ground, places the barrel under his chin, and pulls the trigger one last time. 9:56 a.m., the first assailant in the North Hollywood shootout is dead. Meanwhile, Emil, whose car has both rear tires punctured and the windshield covered with bullet holes, tries to steal another vehicle to escape. For several minutes, he tries to steal every car he comes across, but the first 2 carjackings fail. In one of them, he is seen waving in the direction of Larry, who lies 3 blocks to the east, dead, surrounded by policemen. Emil taps his chest twice, as if to bid him a final farewell. Emil then attempts to steal a 3rd vehicle, and this is it. A beige Jeep arrives in the opposite direction and is blocked by the criminal's white Chevrolet, which shoots out the driver's windshield. The driver of the pickup, hit by shrapnel in the arm and face, doesn't try to understand. He flees immediately. Emil now has a way out. He transfers his weapons and ammunition to the pickup, then tries to start the car. Problem, it wouldn't start. The driver had activated the kill switch, rendering the Jeep unusable. Then a police patrol car with 3 SWAT team members on board arrives at full speed and pulls up in front of the pickup where Emil is sitting, still trying to start the car. Seeing the police arrive, Emil immediately leaves the stolen vehicle and positions himself in the back of his Chevrolet, ready to face the SWAT team less than 10 meters away. For the first time, the confrontation is one of equal firepower, with the officers armed with assault rifles. Escape seems compromised for the fugitive, but that doesn't stop him from continuing the fight. Cornered behind his car, however, he is quickly overtaken by the bursts of SWAT bullets flying everywhere. Emil tries to fire back blindly, but most of the bullets land in his own windshield and on the open trunk of the car. The police continue to fire at Emil, who is shot several times in the chest. But Emil is still alive. Seeing the assailant still crouching and in firing position, the SWAT agents then had the good idea to aim at his unprotected legs. The shots fly off and hit Emil several times. With his legs riddled with bullets, Emil no longer had the strength to continue. He was hit 29 times and lost a lot of blood. The SWAT officers put him on his stomach and handcuffed him. Emil, smiling, then still has the strength to utter a few obscenities and even taunts them, saying,
"Shoot me in the fucking head."
He bled to death on the pavement before the ambulance could arrive. The North Hollywood shootout was finally over.
652 is
attack a tactical asset computer system.
44 minutes of terror. That's what the police and local residents lived through that morning. More than 1,700 shots were exchanged during the North Hollywood shootout, 1,100 of them on the robber side alone. That's one shot every 2 seconds. A botched robbery that left 2 dead, Larry Phillips Jr. and Emil Matasareanu. A real miracle considering the violence of the event, which also injured 8 civilians and 12 police officers, 2 of them seriously, forcing them to end their careers. In addition, 12 police cars were destroyed and 85 civilian vehicles were hit. The hundreds of bullet holes in the walls reflected the horror of what had happened that morning. Now it was time for the cleanup. Finally, the North Hollywood shootout highlighted the glaring imbalance in firearms between police and criminals. The police's shotguns and handguns were clearly no match for the criminals' assault rifles and bulletproof protection. This was done after the North Hollywood shootout, when the LAPD, followed by police departments across the U.S., were issued semi-automatic rifles to prevent further incidents of this type. Police would later discover that Larry Phillips had a copy of the film Heath in his home, a film that the 2 men probably used as inspiration for their robberies. Firearms were also seized during the raids on Larry and Emil's homes, but most of the stolen money, around $1.5 million from previous robberies, was never recovered. A story that ends in mystery.
Unit 603, based on the land. Delta 223. If the officers arriving there, if you can come find their vehicle and we can start looking for cameras or any witnesses, that'd be great. Rescue 3 from FM1, you said Delta side.
Larry.
FM1, you said Delta side.
Larry.
FM1, you said Delta side.
Larry.
FM1, you said Delta side.
Yes,